We arrive at the scene of the fall of man here. Do you recall what Satan says to Jesus when he comes to visit Jesus at the wilderness much later in time? He shows Jesus the whole world and tells Jesus that it's all his, and if Jesus bows to him just for once, he will give it all to Jesus. That's how Satan tests Jesus. Well, one of his ways, that is. The master of this world was changed from God to Satan. The position was shifted ever since the incident at the Garden of Eden. The master of this dark world is Satan and not God, because our ancestors had chosen to side with Satan, instead of siding with God. That's how this whole story of the fall of man goes. Now, why didn't the woman, or the man, for that matters, die right away after eating the forbidden fruit like God had said they would? Now that is a secret that God himself only knows. If they had died right away after eating the fruit, we wouldn't be here. If God doesn't say it, then nobody, not even Satan, knows what God has in him. It is known only when God says it. Satan only knew that the man and the woman would surely die if they ate the forbidden fruit, but he absolutely had no idea the time span between the moment they ate the fruit and the moment they would die. In the end, Adam and Eve surely died, didn't they? They did die. For Adam, he died 930 years later. We don't know when Eve died, but we know that Adam died at the 930 years of age. Death did come for them, but there was a time span from the day they ate the fruit to the day they died. Even though they sinned against God and were destined to die, God granted them 930 years of a probational time. What are they to do during this probation period? From the day they ate the forbidden fruit to the day they die, they were to give birth to children. After Adam and Eve had eaten the forbidden fruit, there were things that God said to each, the serpent, the woman, and the man. To Adam, because he listened to his wife and ate the fruit, and that was his sin, he was to labor and eat the fruit of his sweat. The man would have to work and toil hard, and the land would produce more twigs and thorns than the grain. He would have to labor hard in order to obtain just enough to eat. Good times were over. That's what God said to the man. To the woman, God said he would greatly increase pain in childbearing. That was for certain, wasn't it? This is the kind of information that we cannot obtain from anywhere else, other than from the Bible. This kind of information helps us to distinguish and acknowledge the spiritual world clearly. No other book in this world will tell you things like this here in the Bible. Only through the Bible can you understand the relationship among God, man, and Satan. The stories in the book of Genesis are all original and true. Every logic comes from the book of Genesis. That's why I keep telling you that the Pentateuch is the original source of all theologies. All the other religions in the world have the wrong starting point to begin with. All of their Genesis start off the track. We have the book of Genesis as the right guiding stick. We only worship and serve God and no other gods. We do not bow down to no other gods, and because we bear the image of God, if we get into an argument or dispute with one another, we are doing so with the other image bearer of God. For example, you are not to throw your punch at your friends or other people you know. Why? It is not right to throw your punch at an image of God. So the word, in God's image, is really a fearsome word, in fact. The word is in the chapter 1 of the Genesis. God gave us the book of Genesis to learn things like this, but we have neglected and put aside things we ought to teach and learn for so long. We are such in a sorry state for it. There are about 7 billion people on this earth, and let's say there are about 5 million cars in the world. If you think about the amount of fuel these cars burn in a day, we can estimate the total amount of the fossil fuel under the ground. If you look at the research papers from the petroleum researchers, the original amount of fossil fuel under the ground before people started digging it out was estimated to be about 7 trillion barrels. Can you believe it, 7 trillion barrels? Out of the 7 trillion barrels, we have so far used up about 5 trillion barrels. So there are about 2 trillion barrels left. It is an undisputable fact that the fossil fuel was created when Noah's flood happened. I have a great interest in this field. So whenever I get an opportunity to travel around the world, or visit other places, I tried to gather as much information as I can and organize it on this topic. Out of all the animals in this world, the blue whale is probably the biggest animal of all. If we were to line up all the animals from the blue whale to a tiny little mouse, a sheep would come in the middle, in terms of the size. A blue whale and an elephant would belong to the large animal group, a mouse would belong to the small animal group, and a sheep would belong to the middle-sized animal group. A mouse was still the same mouse before the flood, but the larger animal group also included things like dinosaurs. So it is believed that a man would come in the middle group in the world before the flood. So if all that was buried and became fossil fuel, and that amount was about 7 trillion barrels, there would be a lot more than the 7 trillion if we were to include the ones that didn't become the fossil fuel and were just swept away in the flood water and became fish food. By estimation, the total would be about 10 trillion barrels. Now, it is said that 3 people volume is equal to 1 barrel of oil. Then to make up 10 trillion barrels, you would need about 30 trillion creatures that were just as big as a regularly sized human on an average. By estimation, about 20 to 30 trillion creatures were on this earth before the flood. It was absolutely nothing like what it is now. There were a lot more men on this planet before the flood than after the flood, and not just men, but other creatures, as well. It was just a whole different league. Let's look at South Korea and let's look at its general population. The average birth rate between man and woman is staggering 1.7, and it is getting lower. It is actually the worst in the world, one of the worst, for sure. South Korea has become the nation where the least number of children are born each year. The birth rate is, again, staggering 1.7. People before the flood had lots and lots of children. A typical married couple would have had 30, 60, or even 100 children. I would not be surprised if there were people who had 200 children. It looks like Adam might have had 200 children, probably 100 sons and 100 daughters. The number is literally like 30 times, 60 times, and 100 times more than what it is now, and people really did have lots and lots of children then. In the book of Genesis, Adam's firstborn was Cain and the second-born was Abel. His third child was Seth, and from then on the Bible just says that he had other sons and daughters in the next 800 years or so. He did not stop having children after Seth. After Seth, he had many other sons and daughters for 800 years. He didn't do anything else but making babies. There was plenty of things to eat. There was abundant fruits and other things to eat in the nature. So what else was there to do, other than making babies? And if things were going on like this, can you imagine just how big the general population would have gotten right before the flood? The number would literally be in billions and trillions. Where could all of them have lived then? If you look at the globe now, you will see that about 70% of it is water, right? Roughly 70% of the surface is covered in water right now. There are also many places covered in ice and sand, right? Inhabitable lands lie in some parts in eastern and western side of the Northern America. There are some in Canada, Japan, South Korea, some eastern parts of China, a little bit in the Middle East, and some in the Mediterranean area. This may sound a lot, but that's really about it. In all the surface of the Earth, only about 1/10 of the lands are suitable for men to live on. About 1/3 is covered in ice, another 1/3 is either high mountains or deserts that people cannot live on. We men can use only about 1/10 of the surface of the Earth. In this small portion of the lands, there are still 6 to 7 billion people in this world. Before the flood, though, there wasn't really much difference in temperature throughout the lands. The North Pole, the South Pole, and lands had a like temperature. People found fossils in Siberia that were similar to the tropical plant fossils. The tropical plant fossils that were found in the southern portion of the lands and places like Thailand were also coming up in Siberia. The weather before the flood was totally different than the weather of today. Also, if you travel below the normal sea level, like 180 to 200 meters down, you will find the flat surface. This surface is also known as the continental shelf. Have you heard of it before? This flat land called the continental shelf under the sea was once the land where the people prior to the flood were living on. People lived here before. The continental shelf is actually quite the vast flatlands, and if you travel a lot further down, you will get to the deep sea. It does go down pretty deep, like a few thousand meters in depth. That is the old sea and the flat land. The continental shelf is the land that people once used to live on. Then, just how much water rose up during the flood? The sea water rose up at least 200 meters from the ground level. With the water rising up 200 meters from the ground level, everything was submerged under the water. 70% of the lands disappeared under the water and only 30% remained. The lands near the equator became deserts, so people could no longer live there. The northern and southern ends were frozen and a tiny bit area was only inhabitable to men. So if you do your researches on the world before the flood, and study and organize information about the crude oils and things like fossils, you get to see the world before the flood and what it was like. Before the flood came, there were more people than any other creatures in the pre-flood world. There were definitely a lot more people than today. Take the town I live in as an example. There aren't that many people, and animals, too, in my town. Maybe a few boars, some deer, rabbits, and so forth, as far as the animals go. It will probably amount to one truck full altogether, I think. There is really nothing in my town, but just a few houses and people. About 200 people on an average gather for my Bible seminar, and if the ground were suddenly to open up and swallow all of us in, and we all become the fossil fuel, it won't even be enough for our children to use to run the motorcycles. Laugh. Even with the whole residents of the big Seoul city, they won't even be enough to last a month. The world before the flood wasn't like the world we're living in right now. There were a lot more animals and other creatures like dinosaurs lived too. With the water rising, tornadoes and hurricanes terrorizing all over the places, and literally mountainous tsunami swallowing everything up, people and all the animals were moving up to the higher ground because that's all they could do. As they were passing through one hill, the ground suddenly broke up and swallowed up everybody, and everything went under the water and mud in an instant. The whole mass of thousands of people and animals all at once got buried under the sand and became the fossil fuel. That's the story. The Mesopotamia regions have many crude oil-rich deposits because these areas were once considered to be high grounds. Like I said earlier, people before the flood were living on the flatlands 200 meters below the current sea level, and when the rain didn't stop and the water began to rise up, people were moving to the higher grounds and became buried underground, and that's why places like Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Arab Emirates and Iraq have vast amount of oil deposits. Long before the flood came, people were deceived thinking that eating the forbidden fruit would open their eyes and make them like God, and they ate the fruit. Did they really become like God after? Like heck, they did. Instead they became more and more corrupt to a point where a reconciliation was not possible. Even the Almighty God could not fix men. He had only one choice left, and it was wiping out the entire civilization. It came to a point where God had to start all over again. After eating the fruit that made people to know both good and evil, sometimes they appear to be good, but other times they are like devils. It's like having the split personalities. The man of sin. There is sin and al, so there is man, a sinner. We have become the men of sin. We know both the good and the evil, when, in fact, we only should know the good. Ever since the sin came into people's lives, people have fallen into such an irreconcilable shape. So even after the flood, people eventually turned away from God again, and in the end we see that they built the Tower of Babel. The fact that people built the Tower of Babel shows that they had lost faith in God already. God had promised that he would never bring about his judgment with a flood, and the water that once covered the whole earth slowly, but surely, subsided. I believe it was this time that the orogeny had occurred. New mountains formed, some old mountains went down, and some new ones popped up. For this reason, it has become impossible to find places that existed prior to the flood. For example, there still exists the river Euphrates, but we don't know where the river Pishon used to be. The Bible says rivers originated from the Garden of Eden, but we cannot know for certain where exactly the Garden of Eden was located. The best guess is that it has either been deformed and perished or become a desert. Either way, we don't know where it was. What we, however, know and can see is that there are evidences that the earth was once covered in water. If we were able to level all the mountains in the world in a way that everything will be submerged under water, so that the earth will have nothing but water, the average depth of ocean will be 2,400 meters. crushing down high mountains like the Mount Everest and the lands as well, and putting everything down under the ocean so that the Earth will be a perfect round ball. It will make the Earth's average ocean depth to be 2,400 meters. There is that much water in the world, and what made the lands to rise up again after the flood was because the new landmarks were formed during the flood. A new active orogeny had happened. One of the evidences that shows that the ocean water came inlands is the salt water lakes around the world. The Dead Sea is one of the popular salt water lakes, but there is also a popular salt water lake called the Lake Van at the bottom of the Mount Ararat in Turkey. This Lake Van is located 1,700 meters above the sea level. So that means its location is higher than regular mountains, and this salt water lake is located high above the ground, and its water is like the ocean water, it is salty. Salt water fish like the herring lives in the Lake Van. So it's like a sea, but it's located 1,700 meters up above the current sea level, which means the ocean water once came up to this height, got trapped due to the shape of the land, and the water remained there ever since. You pass this Lake Van on your way to the Mount Ararat in Turkey. And if you pass this place and head over to Iran, there is a lake in the northern direction in Iran called Lake Urmia. This Lake Urmia is located 1,470 meters above the sea level. This lake's location is also just as high as any mountains, and its water is, of course, the salt water. I had bought some salt from there before, and the taste of it was simply superb. Also, we don't see a lot of animal fossils, but among the animal fossils, we see fish fossils a lot. Now, if a fish had died without seeing any catastrophic natural disaster in its life, then that fish does not become a fossil. If a fish dies naturally as the nature intended it to, it will just float in the water until other fishes consume its body and nothing will be left of the fish, right? It will never become a fossil this way. Also, have you seen just how fast a fish moves in the water? It is so quick that it moves like a bullet. A catastrophic earth-moving natural disaster must occur that this quick fish can't even escape from it. Such an event must occur for the fish to become a fossil. In other words, either a volcano under the ocean had erupted suddenly or other natural disaster had occurred, and the fish was trapped and compressed in the earth. When enough time has passed and the section that the fish had been trapped had solidified and become a rock breaks up and surfaces, we can see the fish in a fossil form. This proves to us that there once was a natural disaster which reformed the landscapes. Tons of different forms and shapes of fish fossils have been found in different places in the US, and without a sudden natural disaster like an underwater volcano eruption which caused the grounds to break and uproot and swallow up all the fishes, that many fossils simply cannot be formed. Plus, just because something gets trapped under the earth, that doesn't mean it will fossilize. It has to go like this: something gets trapped suddenly, the surrounding environment needs to solidify suddenly, and there must be heat. As we are discussing this with a list of various requirements, we get a sense of an idea that when the rain came during the flood, it wasn't just a lot of water from the sky that came, but also other natural disasters came along with it. Volcanoes erupted, lava was shooting out of the ground, things other than water fell from the sky, and etc. Many things are being said here in the Bible without actually showing things to us. Now, some people would argue how the general population could have grown so exponentially with mere 8 people in just 4,500 years. In truth, though, a small 0.5% increase in the general population could cause the population of the entire Earth to increase twice over time. Not long ago, the population increase rate used to be 2%, not like today's. These days many couples cannot even have one baby, which is truly a strange phenomenon. In my days, typical mothers would have about 5 children. If you had 3 children, they would say it still felt lonely with just 3 children. If you had just 1 child, then your house would have been the house of sorrow and despair. By the way, my mother had 7 children. So, it is very much possible to have a family of 8 people to become 15 billion people in 4,500 years with a birth rate of 0.5%. The actual birth rate in the old days was roughly about 2% and not 0.5% like today. This means, if the same birth rate continued on, the number of the population would have been 50 billion. It is very much possible, given the time. It is just a matter of time, really. Now, even though there are about 30 different ways to measure the age or time, the evolution theories always go with the one that gives them the longest time possible, or the oldest. Also, using the uranium-238 to measure time is wrong. Once a man named William Libby came up with a time-measuring method using the carbon-14 and its half-life. This method later turns out to be false, too. He said the half-life would take about 5,400 years, but sorry to say that it isn't the case. The other scientists later studied his method and tried it out themselves. It was, in fact, after Libby had won the Nobel Prize that the other scientists re-examined his method, and the scientists named Seuss and Antefs concluded that the speed at which the carbon-14 is both formed and deteriorates is not constant. They found that the speed in question differed depending on the surrounding variables, so Libby's method turned out to be unreliable, to the least. Using the carbon-14 method on a snail shell yielded various results as well. For example, it would say it was 2,300 years old, and other times it would say different ages. It produced results that weren't constantly equal. So what we learned to be the correct age estimation calculation in school is useless, and the results that these calculations produced aren't really reliable data. There was a time when the method was applied on a living tree, and the result said the tree was from 10,000 years ago. It is a living tree at the present time, but the result said it was a dead tree specimen and it was thousands of years ago. They did another test on an artifact that was believed to be 500 years old, and the test results said that the object was 6,000 years old. Another test on a live seal produced a result that said it was 1,300 years old. Another test on a 30-year-old bone of a dead seal came out to be 4,600 years old. It all goes to show that the method of time estimation has very little to no meaning and worth. And yet these things keep showing up in our school textbooks. Why? I could give you other examples on how incorrect the time calculations are. When the astronauts came back from the moon, they brought a few rock specimens with them. When the scientists applied the time measurement calculation on one of the rocks, one method would show 2 million years old and the other method would show 2.8 million years old. These calculations are useless. There was this story. The Earth is basically one big magnet, and because of it, the Earth has its own magnetic field. So far, so good. But this magnetic field is decreasing very gradually. So the scientists performed a calculation, factoring in the fact that the Earth's magnetic field is decreasing, and the calculation told the scientists that the Earth was not older than 10,000 years old. A man named Thomas Barnes from the University of Texas in El Paso, Texas, did a research on the Earth's decreased magnetic field between the year 1835 and 1965, and his research concluded that the Earth's magnetic field decreased the half every 1,400 years. So if the Earth's magnetic field decreased at the same rate since the very creation of the Earth, and if you backtrack the years too far back, the Earth's magnetic field would have had been so strong that the Earth would have melted away like liquid due to the immense Joule heating from the powerful magnetic field. So if that is true, and the Earth's magnetic field really does decrease the half every 1,400 years, it would mean that the Earth's magnetic field would be 64 times more powerful than the current state about 11,200 years ago, 128 times more powerful about 22,400 years ago, as well, and the Earth would have had melted away like an ice cube on a hot plate. The conclusion of this research was that the age of the Earth was about 10,000 years old at most. Then there was this story once, too. This thing called the space dust drifts in space, and some of it come to the Earth. It's kind of thing that we see in the summer night sky, the shiny thing. It is really a fragment of an asteroid between Mars and Jupiter that got broken off and became drawn by the Earth's gravity. As it gets drawn into the Earth's atmosphere, it gets burned off, and the heat is what's making it shine in the sky. It is said that about 14 million tons of this stuff get dropped on the Earth. 14 million tons. So if you multiply 14 million tons with 4.9 billion years, that will give you an idea as to how much of this space dust is supposed to have accumulated on the surface of the Earth, and the answer is 60 meters high. But as you can see, there is none. If you ask the evolution scientists why there isn't any of this space dust on the Earth, they would say the space dust has been all washed away by the wind and rain. When the Apollo 11 went to the Moon and landed on the surface of the Moon, people who designed and built the Apollo 11 spacecraft made its landing legs to be 10 meters in height. I think these people really believed that there would be a considerable amount of space dust on the surface of the Moon. There was supposed to be an accumulation of the space dust on the surface of the Earth as high as 60 meters, but it all has been washed away by the wind and rain. Since there is no such thing as wind or rain on the Moon, as well as the weaker gravity than the Earth, as the gravity up there is only 1/6 of that of the Earth, people figured there would be some accumulation of the space dust on the surface of the Moon, maybe as high as 10 meters. So if not designed accordingly, the spacecraft would be stuck in the space dust. When the Apollo 11, however, landed on the Moon, the dust on the surface was only enough to make a footprint. So estimating the Earth's age with the space dust and saying that the Earth was about 4.5 billion years old is false and does not make any sense. Besides these, there are still about 30 to 40 ways to estimate the Earth's age. Typically, though, these calculations spit out numbers in between 10 to 20,000 years. To the evolution scientists, however, they need to make the years much, much longer in order to support their evolution theories. So they tend to say things like 4 billion or 5 billion years. So if we look at how things have been up to now, even though the flood during Noah's time is a historical fact, the evolution supporters and the poor scientists try their hardest to deny it. There are only a handful of people who still have honest conscience, and the rest of people are too busy trying to force these false theories onto people and publish their ideas in school textbooks and make money off it. While all this is going in, our children are learning these false ideas in school and are throwing away the Bible as a result. Fourth topic in the book of Genesis is the Tower of Babel. After the flood, God said to the people that they were to be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth. There were only 8 people on the earth after the flood. So God is saying to them to keep increasing in number. After God had brought forth his judgment upon the people with flood, he said, "Never again will all life be cut off by the waters of a flood, never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God gave people a rainbow as a sign of his promise. When can we see a rainbow? We can see it after a rain stops, right? In order for a rainbow to form in the sky, there must be plenty of moisture in the atmosphere, and the sunlight has to come directly into the moisture. The atmosphere during the time of Noah didn't have the direct sunlight. There was water in the upper atmosphere that had blocked the direct sunlight. A rainbow could have only been formed after the flood, if you think about it scientifically. And after the flood, the life on Earth, was literally in a mess. Basically most of the water in the upper atmosphere had come down and covered the lands. So big changes had occurred on the surface of the Earth. The single most obstacle that the people faced was food, as there was nothing left to eat. Listen carefully now, okay? This is a part that I need your undivided attention and focus. Before the flood, during the beginning time of the book of Genesis, and at the Garden of Eden, what people ate for food was not meat. People are vegetable, grain, and fruit for food. People ate vegetables. Eating meat was only allowed after the flood. Why do you think that was? The water was now 200 meters higher than what it used to be before the flood. All the lands that people used to farm before were now under the water, and even if it weren't the case, all the vegetation was under the water for a long period of time that they all perished. So there was literally nothing to eat. What was available for people to eat were some animals that had calves while in the ark, or fish in the water. In other words, meat was the only food source that was available to the people after the flood. People had no other choice, so God allowed them to eat meat then. Later on, though, when they were coming out of the Egypt, God gave them an instruction as to which meat they could eat and could not eat. That was how things came to be concerning eating meat. This is one of the reasons why I try limit eating meat, because as you can see, meat wasn't always the food choice for men. If someone cooks and prepares a meat dish for me, I would eat some, but typically I try to stick to eating vegetables, and to be honest, I like it that way better. I still have my strength and my skin is still clean and without any blemishes in my old age. If you don't believe me, come and feel my skin, laugh. It is better for men to eat grains, vegetables, and fruits, it is better for our health. People say eating meat gives them strength, but that is a misunderstanding on their part and is a self-hypnosis. Look at the animals that are normally powerful and huge in the nature, they are all herbivores. A lion is the biggest animal among the carnivores. Look at animals like a giraffe, an elephant, and a bull, they eat grass and leaves and they get big and strong eating just grass and leaves. You see how our world became a totally different place after the flood, and the biggest problem after the flood was that now the sunlight was directly coming into the world, which resulted the lands to become deserts. Plus the northern and the southern ends of the earth became the ice lands. The amount of inhabitable lands was considerably decreased after the flood. People were now struggling in choosing the ideal lands that they could not make a living on. This was the new scene after the flood. And as people started eating meat, their lifespan began to shorten, on top of getting the direct sunlight. Now Noah was getting old and his children's faith in God began to cool off. When Noah became about 890 years old, Terah begot Abraham. In other words, Noah was still alive until Abraham became about 60 years old. And in the midst of all this, God's desire for the people was for them to scatter all over the earth. Remember that one? But what do people do? As before, they just want to live in a big city, and that's exactly what people did after the flood. The people gathered around the Tower of Babel, and if God became angry again and brought the flood on them again, they would climb up the tower and save their lives. That's what they thought, and that's how they were able to unite with one another. So God came and confused their language. A man named Nimrod was the leader in leading people to build the Tower of Babel. He was the man who went against God and took charge in building the tower. In the end, God came and confused people's language, and once many different languages emerged overnight, there was a great confusion about the people. Not just the languages became incomprehensible, so did the hand gestures. It is believed that when people's language was confused, there were about 10,000 newly formed languages. Many languages have died off since then, and now there are about 6,500 languages around the world. It is also believed that about 2 languages die off every 2 weeks. Nimrod thought that God's purpose for people to scatter all over the world was so that there wouldn't be one united powerful government of people, and it would make God to control people with ease. So he persuaded people to remain in one place, went against God, and lead people in building the Tower of Babel. This is a story from the Jewish Encyclopedia. This very event of the Tower of Babel was a symbol of how people lost their faith in God. As a matter of fact, it was the pinnacle moment in people's disbelief in God. The Tower of Babel served as a proof of how people did not believe in God's rainbow covenant, that he would never again perish all life with a flood. If we do not believe in God and what he says, then it makes God a liar, we are dishonoring God. Not believing in God is the same as dishonoring God. If someone calls you a total liar, even if it might be partially true, you would not feel so good about it, right? It does not make us feel good if someone does not trust us, even though all of us lie at one point of time, right? Who among us honestly has never lied in their life? Exaggerating is a form of lying, and so is reducing. So in any shape or form, it does not make us feel good when someone calls us a liar and does not trust us, but God doesn't lie. And if you do not trust God, that means you are treating God as if he is a liar.